So I've been reading 39 Steps by John Buchan. And although I'm here at Lake Takapo, it could be a stand-in for Scotland, one of the lochs. Reading the book, it reminds me of the movie that I saw recently, the Alfred Hitchcock version from the 30s. Very famous, very popular film. But of course, the book was written before and into World War One. That film was leading into the troubled times before World War Two. And there will be changes made, of course. Therefore, never judge a book by its movie. The 39 Steps by John Buchan. And Heather Reeds told me some time back that John Buchan was the Governor General of Canada, which is correct. Never knew that, so thank you, Heather, for pointing that out. So rather than just talking about the book, I thought it was a good opportunity to talk about how often books are made into movies or plays or something like that. And I have to say from the very beginning, I always have the maxim that the original is always better. It's amazing in itself how so many adaptations alter things. Sometimes potentially for the good, often not. And there have been many adaptations of the book into movies or productions for TV. I'm only going to be talking about the Alfred Hitchcock version from the 30s. Why possibly certain choices were made that's not in the book. But I will do that as I go along. As to the book itself, it's a rollicking read for sure. And I've got some notes here. I've written down as I was going through it, a crazy game of hide and seek. That's what Hannay says. And really, for the majority of the book, it's going from one encounter to another. Often the character Hannay and another person, probably some in the background floating around. And as one character says, it's all pure Rider Haggard and Conan Doyle. So, the book then. The protagonist is from South Africa, or Southern Africa. He often mentioned places like Matabele land and the Veldt. So that part of the world, I no doubt have just edited out a piece, because whenever I say Alfred Hitchcock, I always say Halfred Hitchcock. That may happen as I go through. Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock. There's no H in Alfred. In the Hitchcock version, Hannay is from Canada. Why that change? I don't know. Well, the first thing to consider is that the book was written, obviously, before World War One. The times were a bit fraught. There'd been a lot of problems in the Balkan countries. Bulgaria, Romania, Montenegro. And that was considered to be a tinderbox that could erupt into a war. And of course with Serbia and the Black Hand Gang, Gavrilo Princip, that in fact was the case. It takes time to write a book. It takes time to get accepted. It takes time for the editing, and then there's potentially always a delay until the book comes out. So for my own books, it took up to a year from submission and final editing to when it came out. This book does not reference World War One in itself. It was unknown when it was written, but it came out in 1915, and the war, the Great War, had already commenced. This was written beforehand, but it's... and again, there's going to be some spoilers. Buchan wrote at a time of high tension, and he projects that the war will happen in a certain way, which we know didn't happen in fact, reality, but he didn't know that at the time, and he would have been writing with the potential audience who was going to read the book would know of tensions, and it would make sense to them at the time. But of course, preceding events overturned what was said. But it still came out in World War One, and in fact, I don't think it came out as a novel. It came out as part of a magazine. So it would have been interesting for people at the time to read this, knowing that, well, hang on, you're slightly out of date now, aren't you? So then it comes to Alfred Hitchcock, and he's deciding to make this into a movie. At that time, the tension had changed. It was now leading up to World War Two. So obviously, at the very beginning, the adaptation, the screenwriting, couldn't really mirror the book. It would have been almost 20 years out of date. People would have laughed, unless it was to be a historical period piece. But it wasn't. It was done contemporary. And therefore, the idea of 39 steps was not leading up to the Great War. It was the tension that the Germans, Nazi Germany at that time, was trying to steal the plans of fighter aircraft that were being developed by the British. So the different sensibility of tension is different in the adaptation. Also, as I say, Hannah is from Canada, and that's probably referring to the fact that slyly Buchan was the Governor General of Canada. So Hannah is in London. He's at a loose end, and I'm talking about the book now. And he's pretty much done with London. He's a bit scathing, actually. There's a wonderful thing here. And it's literally almost the second sentence. I had been 3 months in the old country and was fed up with it. The weather made me liverish. The talk of the ordinary Englishman made me sick. I couldn't get enough exercise, and the amusements of London seemed as flat as soda water that has been standing in the sun. So he was obviously ripe for adventure. In the book, he meets a gentleman called Scudder, who ends up in his flat. In the film, it's a woman. Both of them they get taken out. Scudder by a knife, and the woman by a shotgun. Why the change of gender? Well, if there's anything that could be said about the book, there are no women in it. It's absolutely sans femme. There's no women at all. In a film, you can almost imagine that would antagonize half of the potential audience more than it would in a book. And therefore, there is a female or two females throughout, and one becomes a love interest for Hannah when he's on the run. That doesn't happen in the book, but it happens in the film. But up until that time he gets on the run, they follow parallel, so one can understand the choices there. Hannah in the book has to get into disguise to get away from the flat because it's being watched. And in fact, one of the themes, I wrote down the themes here, and one of them is disguises. Hannah is always changing his appearance, and at the very end, he talks about a conversation he remembers with a PNR in southern Africa, which is all about the reason why spies go into disguises. And it's not just putting on the disguise, it's actually believing that you are the person that you're portraying, which becomes crucial, especially at the end. But Hannah is always changing his look. That never happens in the movie. And what's amazing, to the point of, how many people he meets of the exact size that he can wear their clothes? All the time is changing his look. And there are people who willingly give him his clothes, and you think, well, I thought, in the first instance, I get it, but then it happens all the time, and it's starting to become a bit, I wouldn't say unbelievable, but it's getting to that edge where this guy can just get out of problems all the time. He meets someone who helps him, someone gives him his clothes, a car, and so on. It's improbable how many people he meets. That's what I wrote down here. Either he knows. There's one chap he meets in Scotland, and then he does in the streets of London. In fact, that's mirrored in the film. On the train in the film coming out of London, he meets a woman, and it's famously on the bridge, the Forth Bridge, which, again, Hannay doesn't see at all in the book. In fact, he goes to the opposite side of Scotland. And that woman he then meets later in a political meeting, which is in the book. So it's improbable how many people he meets or either knows or they have connections that can help him, and I'm talking connections at the highest level, or are willing to assist. It's amazing. I've got a quote here on page 71. Yeah, and he actually states who these people were to remind us. There was the milkman, the literary innkeeper, Sir Harry, the roadman, the idiotic Marmee, were all pieces of undeserved good fortune. Well, you're not kidding. In both the book and the film, this is Hannay, he's on the run. So he finds out that there is this supposed plot to dispatch a dignitary well known in the political circles of Europe called Carolides, and it's going to happen on a certain day. And because Scudder is the spy that's found all this out, who is in Hannay's flat and cops it, now down to Hannay, because he's potentially going to be collared for having committed a crime in his flat. He has to go on the run, and he has to find out or resolve this case. And he gets into Scotland, and he's on the run, just like in the film. But in the book, he's on his own. He does meet a woman who helps him in a cottage, but that's about it. In the film, it's more about showing Scotland as a character, and certainly Scotland in the book is a character. So they're similar. In the film, there is a police helicopter that's trying to find him and his love interest. He, in the film, was played by Robert Donner. And who was the woman? Madeleine Carroll, who is interesting on her own and in her own right. I think she won an award for helping out something to do with the war. So he's on the run. In the film, it's a helicopter, but in the book, it's a monoplane, which fits in with the era, of course. The plane had just become, or was becoming, important. But in both the film and I guess to do with the book, Hannay is unflappable in the movie. He's a Marty Sue character. In other words, it's almost as though nothing phases him. And although it fits in with the time, the English stiff upper lip, or in his case, a Canadian stiff upper lip, or in the book's case, South African, it no doubt feeds into the audience at that time's expectation of standing up for king and country. But it becomes almost at times ridiculous, I would think, because nothing in the film phases him. He even literally gets out of a train onto a bridge and hides, and he just manages in the film all these things that come his way. In the book, that doesn't happen. He's not put into such ridiculous situations. I mean, they are implausible at times. But the book, Hannay, does make mistakes, and he does have doubts, which you never sense in the movie. So the character of Hannay is much more rounded in the book, and of course it's got more time to develop that character. He is fallible in the book, but he's not in the movie. Now, that's the movie. If you'd had seen the movie and knew it's been very popular, very successful, there are things in the movie that have been put in, or were put in by Hitchcock, that had nothing to do with the book. So if you've ever seen the movie, there is this one scene where he escapes the flat. He gets to the train station in London, and he's sitting in a carriage, and there are two gentlemen in front of him who are having this talk that's got nothing to do with anything. And after they have gone out of London, you never see these characters again. And you think, what's that to do about? They were talking about women's corsets. And then just before the train leaves, there is another person in the carriage who's not been involved. He's a priest, and he gets up in disgust because two gentlemen are talking about women's underwear. And he leaves the train, and as he walks by outside, he looks back in through the windows, and he's looking longingly at the corset, then realises he's being watched and walks off. Why was that in the movie? And you think, well, you might not think at all. You might just listen to it, watch it, and then the story moves on. But Hitchcock put that in as a fingers up to the Hays Code, which had come in America, which suddenly had changed what could be talked about and shown in any movie. And it was almost like Hitchcock couldn't resist the fact that although he was a British director and he was making a British film, he knew that the movie was going to be released in the States and would face or have to stand up to a lot more stringent code of ethics. And that was a fingers up by saying, look, I'm going to get very close to subverting your rules and I'm going to poke fun at them. And that's what that was about. But of course, that's not in the book. Let's talk a bit more about the book rather than the film. There is a major red herring. The Balkans and the Karaleides plot isn't what we think or what we're told it is at the very beginning. Hannay finds this out. He breaks the code that Scudder, a spy, had been using. And in fact, in the film, the 39 Steps is the name of an organisation that's trying to take away the secrets of the British, to do with building of planes. In the book, the 39 Steps are physically 39 steps down from a villa at a place called Bradgate in Kent. I wonder if that's real. Is there really a Bradgate in Kent? I don't think there is. Bradgate, by the way, is an interesting name as far as I'm concerned, because I grew up in northwest Leicestershire, and there is a Bradgate Park, Bradgate, but it's not in Kent. It effectively is a place of holiday villas high up on a cliff, and there's 39 steps down to the beach, and it's where the Germans, having stolen the plans, are going to get out of the country. The actual organisation in the movie is the 39 Steps. In the book, they're called the Black Stone. And I'm just going to read out from page 44 and 45. And it talks about that Black Stone are not our allies, but our deadly foes. They're working for the Germans. And in fact, what's interesting is the setup to the era in which the book is taking place hypothesizes the following. It says, but Berlin would play the peacemaker and pour oil on the waters, till suddenly she would find a good cause for a quarrel, pick it up, and in 5 hours let fly at us. Our coast would be silently ringed with mines, and submarines would be waiting for every battleship. And the Black Stone are German spies who Hannay meets in Scotland and then in Kent. And Hannay can speak German because he was involved or in his background was in areas which had been German Africa. There is two highly improbable events that I think almost break the fourth wall, so to speak. He is in Scotland. He's meeting all these different people, often taking their clothes or pretending to be them. It's that theme of disguise. And for some reason, unknown reason, he suddenly tells a semi-stranger his tale. There really is no reason for it. It's a wannabe politician. But when he gets his confidence, this politician, He goes to a political rally, which again happens in the movie, but slightly differently. This politician wants to help him, and he himself has a godfather who happens to be the permanent secretary in the Foreign Office. Go figure. A few questions to follow up and just think about. From a book, it's always perplexed me as to some of the reasons certain changes are made in movies or adaptations. And in fact, that's become a recent debate. I think George R.R. Martin has talked about it, and how a lot, not in this case necessarily, but how books, the choices made almost seem to be that the people who are making the movies or whatever want to be different for the sake of being different. Now, I understand that a lot of scenes in certain movies you just couldn't afford to make, even with modern CGI, but especially in the past. A classic example would be War and Peace. So in War and Peace, in the 60s, Bondarchuk made the Russian version of 3 films. And he was gifted years in which to make it, a lot of money. And the Soviet Union gave him access to tens of thousands of soldiers who would dress up in Napoleonic era uniforms. And they filmed, I think it was the Battle of Borodino, using mass scale logistics and extras. It was amazing. But that was very unusual. And it was done, I think, for the Soviet Union as a form of pride, to show that this historical event really happened, and they were going to spend a lot of money for it. I wouldn't say for propaganda, because the movies were never going to be shown en masse in the West. You can get to see them now on YouTube. But the Western versions had less men. I think there's a Rod Steiger version, Waterloo, and Christopher Plummer. They got a lot of extras, but nothing in comparison to the big battles. So if you're going to make an adaptation of a movie of the scope of War and Peace, you're going to have to effectively make choices, especially with the big set designs and places that famously take place in historical settings. If you can't get access to that place, then you've got to make do with others. I get that. I also know that a lot of books, if they have stream of consciousness, it's difficult to film. And then there's always the stress of time and money and whatever. So that's why books, I think, are more powerful. For myself, the movies that do a really good job are the ones we will talk about for decades. And we are doing that for Lord of the Rings, aren't we? The trilogy we're still talking about, because they did such a good job. But even then, so much was taken out. And no Tom Bombadil and so on. So the films almost take the essence of the book and they go their own way. As to the book itself, it's an interesting read. I'd never read it fully all the way through. I think as a younger man, I may have started it. I remember the character Hannay, but that's about it. It's a book of its era. I can see why it's popular. It's a man standing up, doing his best to fight for country and do the best under circumstances when he's being chased by the authorities. He's like a fugitive on the run. That's stressful, it's tense. And how is he going to resolve this? How is he going to get through to the end? I think there was a genre of writing at the time. It's like Boy's Own Annuals, where you had this hero like Quatermain, King Solomon's Mines, that kind of stuff. They got into improbable situations and got out of it. It's enjoyable, it's a rollicking ride. But you've got to, I think, suspend belief at times. But then again, when you often come across certain historical characters who are real, and you were to write their story, you'd think, oh, that's no way could that happen. It's ridiculous the amount of things he gets into and gets out of. And I would cite, and I don't think I've got the book in front of me now, Nagel's journal, who I've talked about. And then there is, in the Master and Commander books, Aubrey is based on Cochrane, a historical character who did improbable things at sea. And if you was to write about him, you wouldn't believe it. And so, similar to Sidney Smith, who's another daring-do captain of the era of Age of Sail, you think that no way would they have done all the things that he was supposed to have done, but he did. And in wartime, First and Second World War, there's always people, men and women, who get into incredible scrapes and somehow manage to get out of them. Being ex-military and knowing somebody who's ex-military and has been in a field of intelligence work, know that there are improbable stuff that people do, and what is described in the 39 Steps shows a world that from the outside, people who don't know that world think, oh, that's no way would that have happened. It's impossible that they could keep meeting these people to help them. People do. So although it's improbable, it's not impossible. And I think, if I am correct, it's actually, Hannah is based on a character, I think it's called George Ironsides. Just let me check, I should have done this earlier. No, he's called Edmund Ironside, who was Scottish, and he was a spy during the Second Boer War. And he served as the chief of the Imperial General Staff during the Second World War. He said, at the end of the war in May 1902, Ironside, with a small force, escorted Jan Smuts, I think he was the president or premier of the Union of South Africa, to peace negotiations. He disguised himself as an Afrikaans-speaking Boer, taking a job as a wagon driver working for the German colonial forces in Southwest Africa. So it's based on a real character, and therefore that carries a lot of weight. And possibly would have done something similar as to Hannah did. There's a key thing in here that's right at the end where Hannah is back in London and he's having a meeting with some high officials, generals, and supposedly the Admiral, the First Sea Lord, comes in, but it's not. It's one of the spies dressed up and sits down in a meeting, and no one realises that he's the spy. They believe he's the real Admiral of the fleet. And afterwards, Lord Alloa, he's supposed to be called, the living image of him, Hannah tells them that they've been duped, and one of them says, this is General Winstanley, but it's madness. Do you mean to tell me that the man came here and sat beside me for the best part of half an hour and that I didn't detect the imposture? And then for the remainder of the book, especially when Hannah himself goes into the room and confronts these spies and has a game of cards before he blows a whistle and the police arrive, he sets up for the reader, this is Buchan now, that if you're thinking somebody is so-and-so, even though you think, I recognise them, but they are maintaining this disguise, it's not disguising your features, it's for the person in the disguise really being that person. We get duped. So, a rollicking read, improbable on the surface, but obviously, no doubt, part of the spycraft that many people today still undergo. They do. And I know they do. So the 39 Steps. Interesting use of language, very blunt, to the point. My guest was lying sprawled on his back. There was a long knife through his heart which skewered him to the floor. And it often goes from dark to light. The air had a queer, rooty smell of bogs, but it was as fresh as mid-ocean, and it had the strangest effect on my spirits. I actually felt light-hearted. I might have been a boy out for a spring holiday tramp instead of a man of 37 very much wanted by the police. And it takes you along this journey to Scotland and back, and he saves the day. The most poignant thing about the book, and I think what puts it into context of its time, is the final paragraph. So the Germans don't achieve what they want to, but there still is a war, because he says, 3 weeks later, as all the world knows, we went to war. I joined the new army the first week, and owing to my Matabele experience got a captain's commission straight off. But I had done my best service, I think, before I put on khaki. I wonder if it would be written today. Obviously, not because of the context, but the way it was written. Yes, interesting read. I'm glad I read it, and I would recommend somebody else to read it, especially if you are into history and into spy novels. So there you go. Ta-ta for now.